Welcome to week 2 of organizational communications. Now this week I'm just going to start with a little bit of a historical introduction to the field of communications. For reasons that I think will become obvious to you as we progress, I don't spend very long on the historical side. Many organizational communication courses in fact devote the whole course to the history of this field, and I don't believe that's a very good use of your time. The main reason for that is the early part of this field was dominated by technology and technological considerations. In my early life I used to be an electronics engineer, and I can remember the names like Nyquist, for instance, coming up in the electronics that I was studying. So people were concerned with the technological aspect of sort of how much information you could cram down a telephone line and that kind of thing, which is really nothing to do with what we're talking about. We don't really care about that anymore, and anyway everything we do is digital, so this is really largely irrelevant. So that's really why I don't spend too much time on it. But it's interesting to have a look. As you go through the slides you'll see names like Shannon and Weaver, and they really did start to imply that there were sociological implications of communications, but that was really a bit of an afterthought. They were still really the Shannon himself was an engineer. I can remember in the electronics sector you had something called the Shannon limit, which was really the maximum amount that people thought that you could send down a piece of wire. So these were engineering considerations. But as you get through to sort of slide 4, you will find that people are beginning to realize that there are other aspects to communications other than the purely sort of technical aspect of it. Here you can see in summary where we're at. Here you can see that even by the end of the World War II, which is sort of 1945, you're really still looking at technological aspects of communications. We haven't really got anything coming in here with regard to sociology yet. Here you can see that it really wasn't until the 1950s when people started to consider that there might be other aspects to communications than purely technological considerations. And Shannon and Weaver in the 50s began to talk about communications from a social perspective. But you can see that this was really relatively late in life. This slide just shows the basic Shannon-Weaver model, where you have information source, i.e. person A, transmitter, you have some form of medium over which the transmission is occurring, you've got the receiver, which is basically heading towards the destination, which is party B, and then in the middle you've got noise here. So this is really very, very basic stuff. This just shows us the basic Shannon-Weaver model, which is person A, here called the information source or transmitter, talking, writing, whatever, sending an information anyway to the receiver is person B. And the idea is that there is a noise source in the middle, which is in some way distorting the signal. So, but there's really no implication here that there are sociological aspects or that the human element is having any influence over this information.
I am of course short-circuiting quite a lot of research and work in this field because some of it really isn't terribly relevant, I don't think, to contemporary communication studies. Here we have a slide saying that Scram added the concept of field of experience to the Shannon-Weaver model. So the Shannon-Weaver was just really party A, transmitter, party B, receiver. Party B at some point will transmit back to party A, and so the communication is complete. And this kind of gets extended in the social sciences because, of course, Party B's transmission to Party A will also impact Party A. So, in the same basis that we are all a function of the communications of which we are part through our lives. I mean, this is part of our characters. So these models are beginning to sort of edge in that direction. Scram is adding his concept of field of experience, and this is really quite dramatic in the sense that we're not just talking about this sort of quasi-technical notion of communications going back from A to B, but we're also now beginning to realize that a communication, if it's going to be the accurate transmission of one sense, one feeling, one piece of information from person A to person B, really does depend on person A and person B having similar kinds of experiential backgrounds. Otherwise, the original communication, by the time it gets to B, could be interpreted in something very different kind of way in which it was originally intended. We're also adding here the concept of noise, which is a highly technical background, really. But in this particular context, it's really designed to mean that anything that creates a distortion to the message is noise. And the whole concept is a bit erroneous in some ways because it assumes that the message is transmitted in some sort of an intact way and gets distorted by other things. If the message was a sort of bit of a garbled mess in the first place, in other words, using imprecise language, for instance, then of course the noise is just adding to that mess to make something even less comprehensible. So, in a sense, the noise can be inherent in the message as well as something it collects on the way.
So here at least we're beginning to see that there is the notion of feedback, that transmission of information is not sort of a one-way process, so there's a slightly dynamic element to it, where you've got an encoder who is basically party A again, the sender of the information. You've got the message itself, you've got the decoder, party B, and that there is a sort of feedback process that occurs here. In other words, we're beginning to see that communications is starting to be felt as to be a dynamic process.
By the time we get into the 1960s with Berlo, we've got a little bit more of a sophisticated process in the sense that communication is now considered a bit more of a dynamic sort of process. There isn't one package which is sort of stuck in a mailbox and received by somebody, perhaps a bit beaten up and tatty, and then maybe responded to in some way when the other person has got a bit of time to open the envelope and read it. We've now got sort of something which is a little bit more of a sort of dynamic process. It's still a long way to go before we get to kind of contemporary ideas. We're not really addressing at this point the fact that the original communication, by its dynamic nature, has the capacity to really influence the receiver, so that when the communication gets returned to party A, B has actually changed slightly, and that of course is reality. It isn't. We don't necessarily recognize it as it happens, but if we have a conversation with somebody, especially about something a little bit meaningful, then the chances are that it does have some ability to change us in some slight way. When you add all those changes together after the myriad of conversations that we have in a year, we can be a dramatically different person. Not always the case, of course. Anyway, we're not quite there yet. But we're beginning to open the door to this kind of process. Now we're a little further on, S.J. Baker's model, and here you can see that the notion behind this is that we have a communication from A to B, and that at the end of the communication both A and B have gone some way to move towards each other, and by the time you get to the end of the communication, you should ideally have sort of A and B within the same field. In other words, their field of understanding of the topic of conversation should be very close. I mean, I'm not sure it should be both circles exactly one over the other, but nonetheless there should be what is called here a complete reciprocal identification. So a mutual understanding that is basically similar between both parties. Well, this very short slideshow was just really to try and complete the picture with regard to organizational communications. There are classes on organizational communications that would in fact only incorporate the sort of information I've got in the slides, but of course make it much more complete. And that is the traditional approach to organizational communications, or was until fairly recently. And as you see, the early stages here are just very technologically oriented. They came out of the evolution of the technical side of communications, in other words, radio equipment and the limitations of transmitting signals and bandwidths down pieces of wire and across the ether, and evolved from that. So they have not really the word communication in this particular context has quite a dramatically different meaning to the way in which we're using it in this class. As you will have picked up on, this class is about communication in the sense of people interacting with other people and the changes that go on in all the parties concerned. Now, those people can be the other side of the world, and you can be communicating across the web. They can be your local community, and you as an organization are trying to improve the image of the organization you work for. They can be you as an organization trying to hire the best possible people you can for a particular position. All these are important aspects of communication, and none of them really have anything to do with how much information you can get around a wire. But I just wanted to include this short slideshow for the sake of completion, really, and I hope you found it interesting.